I became the president of Monticello last January after a very fortunate career in American higher ed. I resigned my tenure at Harvard. My husband and I sold a rather spectacular Victorian home in one of Cambridge's most coveted neighborhoods. We packed up our lives and moved to a place where each of us had spent only a handful of days. I think Dennis had been there for only 2 days. Many people in my life found this odd. A board member who had advised me in my job as the head of Radcliffe's Schlesinger Library asked me if I had had a mental break. So as a way of introducing Monticello, I thought I'd say just a bit about why I upended a perfectly good life to come to the mountain and why I hope you will come visit the place soon. So this is Daniel. Daniel was a student in my History of the American Revolution class in the fall of 2017. I started teaching the history of the American Revolution that year at Harvard. It had remained untaught since Bernard Bailyn retired in 1986, which tells you something about the structure of history in academic higher ed. And I taught this course in a quite standard way, introducing all of the latest scholarship, which decentered the American National Project in all sorts of ways. And this was a student in that first outing of this class. He was a reenactor in the Concord Lexington reenacting fabric. He had wanted to bring a black powder musket to do a demonstration in the classroom. The Harvard police would not allow this. And at the end of the class, our teaching center at Harvard, which was really big on these metacognitive exercises where you reflected on what you had learned, set up an interview booth for me with the students in the class to reflect on the semester's work. And this is a slide from my interview with Daniel, and I asked him as an icebreaker what the reenactment was going to do, or troupe was going to do over the summer. And he said, I don't know, I quit. And was teary. This was something, he was third generation in his family that had been part of this work. And I said, why did you do that? And he said, because what I learned in your class is it's all bullshit and lies. And this was an arresting moment for me, right? Like the thing that I wanted was for him to say, I learned in your class that there are women in this story too. And with my reenactment troupe, I'm remembering the ladies, right? Or that landscape was important, or that all the goods came from Britain. But he had learned from me a kind of anti-civic lesson because I had no intentionality around the ways in which American history and American public life were braided together. I've dined out on this kid's picture a lot. I should pay him a royalty, or at least tell him. But there was a kind of conversion experience in my teaching and thinking from this encounter, where I began to think about how to braid civic purpose from an undistorted, rigorous historical examination of our founding era, which was my specialty. So a second piece of this conversion experience was doing this civic work in the classroom as a Harvard historian. I got pulled into a multi-sited project called Educating for American Democracy, funded initially under the Trump-DeVos DOE and NEH, picked up by the Biden-Harris DOE and NEH. I think it's the only civics project to have been funded by these consecutive administrations. It's a pluralist educational project across many axes, ideological, demographic, field specialty, and I came in as the kind of staff historian for this K-12 history roadmap. It's not a curriculum, it's a roadmap. You can't pass a national social studies curriculum, but a framework that is adaptable state by state was a feasible thing. EAD is organized around 7 themes, chronological and civic engagement, and around 5 design challenges. So you see the themes on the top and the design challenges on the bottom. And the idea was we all face these challenges in the classroom, whatever our classroom is, and we should make them a feature, not a bug, of the way that we do education for democracy, educating for American democracy. Pulling out tensions like a plural yet shared story, exactly the thing that Daniel was missing from my class, and civic honesty and reflective patriotism, which this project launched in the spring of 2021. Thank God we didn't call it critical patriotism, which was one of the things that was on the table at the time. So I just wanted to show you the civic honesty and reflective patriotism design challenge here. How can we offer an account of U.S. constitutional democracy that is simultaneously honest about the wrong of the past without falling into cynicism? Again, Daniel, right, fell into cynicism, and appreciative of the founding of the United States without tipping into adulation. This is part of a student art contest that we ran when the project launched, and the 11th grader from Maryland who did this wonderful drawing wrote in his statement about the work, "In this work, the handwriting we the people represents who is writing our history, and it should be a mix of zealous patriots and represented by the American flag, the more cynical groups, and everyone in between represented with other colors. This ensures that we account for multiple perspectives of our nation's past. There are ink stains on this version of our history, but we should accept that these will remain permanent for all to see." This is an 11th grader. Civic capacity is possible. "Telling the truth about this country is not an act of treason. On the contrary, only when our country is credible can citizens learn to love it." So a rigor and whole history problem on the right, a patriotism problem on the left, and this framework sought to bring those together. As I worked on this Educating for American Democracy project, I redesigned my American Revolution course around its principles and started to do a civically engaged capstone where my students took their content knowledge from a lecture course into sites and museums and other public history organs in Boston, right, which is dense with such things. And the last time I taught the course, I asked the Harvard Provost's office whether they would become a client for my students to consult about what Harvard might do for the semi-quincentennial in 2026. This is the second part of the conversion story. And the provost's office said, "Yeah, sure, I'll take your students on, and they can do a white paper and make a presentation. They'll have something to put on their CVs. But I should tell you, we're not going to do anything because we don't think it's any of our business. It's divisive. It has nothing to do with Harvard. And whatever your students say, we're likely to take a hard pass." I pointed out that George Washington had taken his commission as commander for the Continental Army about 20 feet from where we were standing, that Massachusetts Hall, where the Harvard administration lives, had been occupied by Continental soldiers, and that most of the Northern leaders at the First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, had been Harvard graduates, Harvard way weightier in that work than Yale. And to no avail, right? An administration that saw only division to come from such a moment rather than potential for unity and investment and capacity and field building. And then I got the call from Monticello. Really a way to think about the animating principles behind this Educating for American Democracy and its magical conjunction for, right, that we're teaching for something, for our students as small C citizens to go into the world and do the very hard work of self-government. So I will tell you a bit about what Monticello is. Show of hands, how many of you have been in the last 10 years? Fair bit. So Monticello was the longtime home and plantation of Thomas Jefferson, who began building the place in the early 1770s when Virginia was the only country he knew, and people referred to their colonies as their country. It was also home over Jefferson's lifetime to roughly 400 of the more than 600 men, women, and children whom he enslaved. He dreamed it and they built it. Monticello was a place of perpetual experimentation, a kind of living laboratory for Jefferson's visionary excursions into art and architecture, botany, science, and political economy. The political economy part didn't go so well. I talked to somebody in the UVA hierarchy who was teaching a course on Jefferson's management principles, and I thought, what must that syllabus look like? He didn't have double entry bookkeeping. When you're looking at only one side, it doesn't go well. Anyway, Monticello, a place of perpetual experimentation. Jefferson wrote, "Architecture is my delight, and putting up and pulling down one of my favorite amusements." He directed his enslaved workforce to remake the landscape. As you might suspect, there are no natural mesas in central Virginia, like Beacon Hill. It's a mountain that's taken down. He never stopped revising the building. What you see here is what we know as Monticello II, completed after his long stint in France in the 1780s, after he had seen Villa La Rotonda in Vicenza, Italy. Monticello II is crowned with what I believe to have been the first dome in the United States, which was a preposterously cosmopolitan and ambitious thing to do in the first decade of the 19th century, perhaps especially in central Virginia, which was the frontier. UNESCO recognized the architectural originality of the house and the kindred rotunda at University of Virginia by designating us a World Heritage Site. We're the only presidential home with that designation. We're run by a foundation which was started a century ago right here in New York with the dual mission of preserving Jefferson's world and ideas and educating a broad public about that world and ideas. We're a private nonprofit without ongoing government support at either the federal, state, or municipal level. As a civil society organization, we seek to restore faith in the vitality of the American experiment, honestly explored and perpetually renewed. Design challenge number 5. Over the century of its existence, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation has experimented boldly in the Jeffersonian model. Especially after the historian Dan Jordan became president in 1985, it courageously tackled the complexity of Jefferson's biography and, through it, the paradoxes of our founding. By the late 1980s, Monticello had begun naming slavery in its public interpretation. In 1993, the foundation launched the Getting Word African American Oral History Project, which has grown to be the largest such endeavor since the WPA interviewed former slaves in the 1930s. Such research efforts have restored Jefferson to his world. Here he is beside Anne Elizabeth Fawcett Isaacs, who was born into slavery at Monticello in 1812 and grew up to be a prominent suffragist, committed, as many of the people of the mountaintop were, to claiming the full promise of American citizenship as described in the soaring preamble of the Declaration of Independence, to cashing what MLK called the promissory note of the Declaration. So I headed south, drawn by the opportunity of this very special and very brave institution, which is a beautiful place that does hard things well. And I found among our staff of approximately 400 and our 100 volunteers, passionate people who want to solve problems. I feel like I've left a world of problematizers for a world of problem solvers. who want to solve problems and know that doing so requires a both-and mindset, the ability to hold contradictory things in your head at the same time, which is something that we very badly need in our contemporary politics and social life. Thomas Jefferson may have been our most complex and layered founder. He was a great thinker and statesman whose interests ranged from agriculture and architecture to viticulture. We operate a vineyard. He was one of the first wine cultivators in the United States. He was a champion of modest rural virtues who craved cosmopolitan luxury and therefore died in crippling debt. And of course, his central contradiction, which was the contradiction of an age, the greatest philosopher, I think still the greatest philosopher of American liberty, enslaved hundreds of people, all the while writing about the profound moral evil of slavery, which he began to do in the early 1770s. Jefferson's inconsistencies, the height of his highs and the depths of his lows, shaped his beloved Monticello during his lifetime and shape it still, not least in the form of our audience. So here's an audience shot, who come from almost every zip code in the United States and many countries around the world. One of the gifts of this audience is they come to us without sorting. So they're not sorted by educational level, they're not sorted by political tribe, by creed, or by party. And we are, of course, in a micro-sorted world here at the Yale Club, right? As this Aurora photo that I keep showing you suggests, we are a purple site in a purple state. The reflection pool matters to an evocation of the work, too. I think we reflect America back to itself, and we encourage our guests to reflect as well. My colleagues take over 300,000 visitors a year through the house, interpreting an architectural treasure, the polymathic genius who designed it, and the enslaved men, women, and children who kept it running. Our guides train for 100 hours before they go into the field, which is more than most social studies teachers deploying in the United States. There is no set script for a Monticello tour. Guides write and workshop their own tours within broad guardrails about what we hope guests will learn, think, feel, and do. So back to my Daniel, right? I told him what to learn and think, but didn't give him anything to feel or do. For decades, our guides have led visitors to Monticello through the hard questions that have shaped our history and that power our future. Questions about slavery and freedom, about equality and liberty, about the work of self-government, in which ordinary people are regularly called upon to build fragile coalitions across monumental differences. Having lost the coalitional muscle by evacuating civics teaching from K-12 and, of course, from higher ed. If you're not going to do it in K-12, you're not going to catch up in college. Building that coalition muscle is, I think, a key thing that sites like this do. I believe that Monticello does the work of forging a more perfect union, a population dedicated to realizing Jefferson's soaring ideals and willing to put in the work that it takes to inch toward that impossible goal. So, talking about the now, not about last week's election, but about the opportunity of 2026. We have an important anniversary coming up in 19 months. If 2024 showcases the problem, a deeply divided, highly tribalized, negative partisanship that distorts almost everything in the field before us, can 2026 be part of a solution? I hope that everyone here tonight is aware of the fact that our republic rounds the quarter millennium mark on July 4th of that year, our 250th birthday as one people forged out of many around an idea, the still unrealized promise of equality, liberty, and pursuits of happiness for all. When I talk about this work informally, I say we have the guy that wrote the thing. Here's a sneak peek at our logo for 2026. I love a birthday party, especially the cake, but we the people need to do much more with the opportunity of 2026 than hold hands and wave flags, which is what the America 250 Congressional Commission is working on, or stage a massive military parade, which is one of the things that came out of the 45th administration's 1776 commission. My hope for the semi-quincentennial, and I say that word for a living, I have a vision of a TikTok campaign where famous people try to say semi-quincentennial, and that this could be compelling to the youth. The semi-quincentennial, or semi-quin as we call it in the biz, needs to be a moment of launch rather than a moment of culmination. That's one of the things I think that's wrong with the parade. A moment of refounding, not a time to stand in front of a massive mission accomplished banner. We have massively underinvested in the teaching of civics in schools and in nurturing the civic capacities of adults, and we see the results around us every single day. At the national level, we spend relatively 1,000 times more on STEM in the schools than on civics. That's because STEM is widely and correctly understood as a matter not only of workforce development, but also of national security. So too, civics. Let 2026 be a Sputnik moment for our civic infrastructure. 15 years celebrate the anniversary of the Declaration in 26 and the anniversary of the Bill of Rights in 41. That means that a child who enters kindergarten in 26 will be a college junior or an accomplished apprentice in 41. And I think it's important that we stop always talking about college as the default. I think about what we might teach that young person so that when she comes to maturity, she's ready to take the wheel and steer our enormously powerful and equally demanding form of government. There's a special opportunity in that civic renewal work for community learning partners outside the classroom. We are institutions of high trust because we deliver truth in concrete ways, right? People can see where the evidence on which we base our interpretations is coming from. Literally see, we do a very popular archaeology tour. You can literally see the evidence coming out of the ground. We're doing epistemology at retail, right? How do you know what you know? Oh, we know it because this handprint in this brick. We know it because Jefferson wrote this letter on this polygraph and this record says this thing. I think another distinctive lane of outside the classroom civic learning and capacity building is that we see groups in multi-generational settings, right? So that while culture war over social studies in the schools in most of the country now divides parents from children and parents from teachers, we're seeing multi-generational groups at the same time. We complement schools, but we're not answerable to the same kinds of standards of learning bureaucracies. We're not answerable to state legislatures. We're more nimble. We have more freedom to innovate and experiment in the Jeffersonian mold. For us at Monticello, this capacity building moment means thinking rigorously about what more we can do with the gift of a mass and pluralist audience. And keep in mind, when I say that our audience is not sorted by political tribe, they're not thinking of this as a gift. I am, right? You don't get to choose who you're on a tour with. And if you're at Mount Vernon, or at the Abraham Lincoln presidential site, there's a very good bet that everybody thinks more or less the same thing about Washington, leader, or Lincoln, emancipator. Not true with Jefferson, right? People come making, believing in advance that we're going to smash their Jefferson Lego set, or that we're going to give insufficient attention to the paradoxes of the founding, and they're all on the same tour together, which is one of the reasons guides train for 100 hours. That training includes de-escalation training from our security force. So can we get this audience to learn to talk to each other, and to take that curiosity and desire to meet across lines that divide us back to their faith-based communities, their Rotary clubs, their churches, the bowling leagues that we don't have anymore, right, to any kind of chapter-based organization? How can we teach essential civic skills and cultivate civic dispositions through vital historical content? How can we marry a complete, rigorous, evidence-based history with a spirit of generosity and welcome delivered in a language that meets people where they are and leaves them with a sense of inspiration and possibility? Again, exactly what I failed to do for Daniel, right? Truth, but also purpose. For 2025 and 26, we're leaning into the history of American party politics, arguably as vicious in Jefferson's day as in ours. He certainly thought so, and at the 1800 inauguration, there were armed mobs on the roads from Pennsylvania into Philadelphia seeking to remedy what they saw as election interference. We'll be piloting a Founding Friends, Founding Foes tour centered on the nation's first party system, which Jefferson both forged and lamented, as its hot rhetoric built him up and then cast him down. We'll be exploring the ways that he and his political opponents disagreed and learned to disagree better, leaning on evidence like his extensive correspondence with John Adams and the busts Jefferson displayed around the house of political allies and enemies alike. So Adams looked over his bed in portrait. There's a bust of Hamilton facing a bust of Jefferson in the front hall. He also keeps a death mask of Oliver Cromwell, right? Like how democracies die, and keeps this all in conversation. One of the things about being a civil society organization in the guise of a historic house museum or vice versa is that you have to teach from the built environment that you have, so leaning into portraits and busts and gestures like that. We're going to center heavily on the relationship with Adams as we ask guests to think about why the Constitution's framers feared factions and the ways a party system helped to organize political coalitions that spanned the most natural and therefore the most damaging lines of cleavage, beginning with the cleavages of slavery and sectionalism. I heard a political scientist earlier this week say that strong parties mitigate divisions and weak parties inflame division, and part of what we're seeing right now is weak parties, right? Two parties that are coming apart without an obvious replacement. Just as we lean on objects, we lean on biography. So you won't come through Monticello and hear a political scientist deliver an oration about what parties are supposed to do. You'll hear stories about particular people that you can take home with you, like breadcrumbs to follow to further research. So Jefferson and Adams are the biographical core of this tour in development. They disagreed over great matters of state, from the fate of the French Revolution, Jefferson was pro and Adams was con, to the freedom of the American press, Adams was con and Jefferson was pro until the press came after him too. They sacrificed a rich friendship on the altar of the bitterly contested election of 1800. Adams left the presidential horses in the White House stables for his successor, but he could not bring himself to attend his friend's inauguration. so that when Jefferson, in his first inaugural, offered the famous olive branch after that pitch battle, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," Adams was not there to hear it. But after an 11-year gap in their fertile exchanges of ideas, Jefferson and Adams dared to share and air their differences, and to glory in the mutual love of country that transcended their disparate visions of America's past and future. Jefferson was also pro-democracy, and Adams was con. Adams knew a thing or two about the tyranny of the majority. My colleagues and I hope that Monticello's guests will take solace from this history. We've been in terrible places before, and people found remedies. And more, we hope, as I said, that they'll be motivated to talk to each other in all of their vibrant diversity and disagreement. We plan to pilot facilitated conversations modeled on the ways that Jefferson used his own elegant dining table to encourage vibrant discussions that his granddaughter called feasts of reason. And this is a card game that we have used in such settings that is, you might call Cards for Humanity. That was a joke. Can we set the table in a way that encourages Americans to take risks in good faith in order to know each other better? Jefferson, I think, would have liked the idea. My Monticello colleagues and I talk a lot about what we want our guests to leave with. We all agree that inspiration is the baseline, so that you do not walk away crushed, like my man Daniel. Appreciation for Jefferson and for all who lived and labored on the mountaintop in his day, and for those who have cared for it since, accounting for the miracle of its continuous existence, right? It's an astonishing thing when a house survives for 250 years through flood and drought and war and war and war. We want them to learn humility when confronted with the sacrifices and paradoxes upon which this country was built. I've spent 3+ decades as a historian. I think the two core skills of a historian are empathy and humility, and I would love to talk about that in Q&A. We also want them to feel confidence, not absolute moral confidence in their righteousness, but confidence that the work of reflective patriotism is worthwhile and is possible, that we can speak together about hard things without coming to blows or coming apart, that we can compromise without losing what we hold dear. At the end of the day, what I want our guests to take away is perhaps more dispositional or characterological than content-based. I want them to embrace the Jeffersonian virtue of self-scrutiny, a willingness to look in the mirror and assess, frankly, what each of us must do to continue the work of our very demanding form of government. The semi-quincentennial is an opportunity, above all, for Americans 340 million strong, dazzling in our differences, to rediscover the we in we the people. Late in life, after falling out for many years over politics, Adams wrote to Jefferson, "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other." Let that be a mantra for the renewal of American constitutional democracy. Let us explain ourselves to each other, and let Monticello and you, our partners here tonight, lead the way. Thanks.